Welcome to Season 3 of the Knack for Business podcast. Over 200 episodes strong, we're here to ignite your entrepreneurial spirit with fresh insights, networking gems, and creative strategies that elevate your game. Are you ready to discover what your Knack for Business truly is?
Today's topic is know where you want to go. Your hosts are Bernie Fransford from Creative Insight and Wayne Pratt from Motivate You Inc. So, what can you expect from the Knack for Business podcast? Well, the aim is to help you find your feet in the business world. Whether you're just starting out or you've been at it for a while, we have something for everyone. Our guest today is David Greer from Coach David J. Greer. David is an entrepreneurial coach, author, facilitator. He is the catalyst who gets you to fully live your dreams now. Spend 1 hour reading his book, Wind in Your Sails. Attend a 1 hour talk with him or get 1 hour of one-to-one coaching, and you will have 3 concrete action items that will shift and accelerate your business within 90 days. David specializes in working with entrepreneurs challenged with alcoholism and addiction. He and his wife, Carol Lee, are committed to each other and their 3 children, spending time supporting them in many and varied activities that they are involved with. They live in Vancouver, Canada. And in fact, David was a guest here in June 2024, and welcome back. David, what's your favorite quote or saying, sir?
My favorite quote or saying, certainly from a business perspective, and our topic today is slow down to speed up.
What's the strategy about picking a future date 3 to 5 years out, and what is the import of that for an entrepreneur?
When I was at university getting my computer science degree, I joined a young software startup after the 2 founders. And I liked the place, stayed 20 years, built it into a global powerhouse. And we did strategic planning the way I think a lot of people do strategic planning. We did what we did last year, if we did any. Sometimes I'm not certain we did any. And if we did, it was good last year and incrementally determine be a little better next year. And with some variations on that. When I was doing a lot of angel investing and I took one of my young CEOs to a training session by a guy, Vern Harnish, his couple books, The Rockefeller Habits and Scaling Up, he suggested something completely different, which is start by picking an end date that is 3 to 5 years out. Where do you want to, or maybe even need to be in 3 to 5 years? Pick that date. And between now and then, what are the key capabilities or thrusts that you need to achieve to get to where you want to go in that future date? And I say might need to, for example, if your market is growing at 25% a year and you're growing your top line revenue at 10% a year, you're losing market share every year. If one of your goals is to hold market share, then you need to be growing your top line revenue at the rate that the market's growing. But again, if you don't take that future vision of where you're going to go, you're going to probably miss out on things like that. And I think if year by year you zig and you zag, but do you really end up with a future like business and situation that's really what you want? So this fundamentally changed my thinking completely. It was like a light bulb moment to think about strategic planning by picking this end date and what's your revenue going to be then, how big you're going to be, what markets are you going to be serving. So maybe today you're serving Canada, in 3 years' time, you want to serve the United States too. So that's a key thrust, is to expand your market from Canada to the US. Everything then, all your other decisions, what your goals are going to be for this year, what your goals are going to be for this quarter, are made within the umbrella of this broader vision of where you want to end up. And I have clients that sometimes pick 3 years. I have some that have picked 5 to 6, depending on their situation and kind of the flow of their business. But we actually write December 30th, or we're the end of 24. We're coming near to the end of 24. If we're looking at 3 years, that'd be 25, 26, 27. You say on December 31st, 2027, this is where we're going to be. And it also makes it more concrete, I find, for entrepreneurs and their teams when we write the date down. Pick that date and actually put it in black and white. It helps crystallize it. So it's not just, oh yeah, maybe when. It's, oh shit, we're making a commitment to actually do this by then.
It's strange. I've heard a marketing consultant recently, and he was talking to a company, and they're needing help. startup phase. They need help with marketing product. And he says, "Where do you want to be in 5 years and the number of products you want to sell?" And then everybody in the crew is going, "What does that matter? Need help now?" Yes, but you work back from there. And
Right.
so it's good. Yeah. It's nice to hear it being echoed.
Yeah. And that's, again, I challenge entrepreneurs when I facilitate around this about what markets are you going to be serving? What products, like, will your existing products still have legs? Um, like once you start looking out like 3 to 5 years, you realize, oh, yeah, I'm not certain if our product has good potential in that time frame, but I'm not certain how much potential will have beyond that. So in that time frame, we have to come up with another product.
As you're doing your planning, how do you list and lay out with brutal honesty your and your key team's key capabilities?
So the way I start planning sessions is I always start with what's working. So I start with some positive psychology and some successes, because my experience is that all high performing peoples are like right into the next challenge and they skip over the major achievements that they just have done. But if you're going to go attack if you're going to go climb a new mountain, it's might be higher than the last one, but it's very useful to remind yourself you just finished climbing the biggest mountain you've ever climbed. Because now, like when you go for the bigger one, it's at least in a context, you remind yourself, oh, right, we just climbed the one that was bigger than ever. So we have this potential. And then what I do is I do about an hour and a half where I really get people to do one of the things, Wayne, I think is really important, is to face the brutal facts. What I say to entrepreneurs is, if you can get the brutal fact on the table, in my experience, you can always find some solution. It may be very uncomfortable. It may be an undesirable from your point of view, but you will come up with a solution to that brutal fact. The problem is businesses will and potentially have failed because you didn't face up to the brutal fact. Like, your market's cut in half and your revenue is going to be half next year. And that's the brutal fact. Well, if you face up to it and do what's needed to survive and get through that, you will. But if you pretend the market's going to be just like it has, it can be disastrous. So it's like the things I try and really challenge people is, what's the biggest obstacle in front of the company right now? What's the biggest brutal fact that's facing the company right now? And what's the biggest opportunity? Because my experience, if we look at an obstacle, if we kind of take that coin and flip it over, it's often your biggest opportunity. It may be very, very challenging, but it may be real potential opportunities. So we brainstorm, and I've had sessions with larger teams, maybe 7 or 8 people in total, senior leadership team and the CEO. We might have 50 ideas. Like we might have 50 things down in an annual planning session. Then I give everybody 5 votes and we see what bubbles to the top. With that, we use that to inform. That's again, kind of a snapshot of everyone's feelings today. So we use that to inform like these bigger questions. Some of the bigger strategic directions may be driven by investors or your board or by what's happening in your market. So you kind of have to take some of these other, facts that you have and marry it to, and that may have come up in the biggest obstacle and opportunity and brutal factor, it may not. So I kind of take those together with how you did last year and how well you're executing on your plan from last year. And we take all of that as information. Let us focus on that question you asked, Wayne, which is, so what is the key capability that we're missing? So I think until you get some consensus around the room of what the biggest obstacle or brutal fact is in front of the company at this time, then it's hard to come up with that. And some of it is brainstorming and future, planning, like key thrusts, especially around markets and product. And I've had some very, very vigorous debates in planning sessions, about whether the product roadmap is right and whether, they can make the money they think they're going to make, especially if it's an unreleased product. When I coach people around these sessions, I remind them that you've got the smartest, highest paid people in the room. You're not here to say yes to each other. Like, this is the place and the forum to have disagreements, to have vigorous discussions. Now, I also coach, like, there's bad ideas. There is not bad people. So you can say, I completely disagree. I think that's a terrible idea. I can't say you're a terrible person for having that idea. Right. And so you can't make it personal. It's about the idea and whether we agree with it or not, but we can be pretty vigorous in our disagreement. Um, and then, the thing I look for at the end of a strategic planning session is that my model is to do 2 days offsite for annual planning and 1 day a quarter for quarterly planning. And in the annual planning, we will have established the first quarter's goals as well. So I remind people, like, we meet every 13 weeks. It's 13 weeks in a quarter. So when we leave the room, we have to all as a group be committed to those goals that we agreed to, even if during the day you didn't agree with them. But for 13 weeks, you have to buy in and be part of the team and strive towards those goals. And in 13 weeks, we'll get back together and we can have the disagreement all over again. And maybe one or more of us will have changed our mind in that time period.
I'd like to go into the weeds for a second. You're an author.
Yes.
And I find that everybody on the street thinks they should and going to write a book.
Okay.
And 90% of the people don't. And 30% of people wrote something on Foolscap for a half a day and then quit.
Mm-hmm.
I'm interested about the process, how exciting it was, how hard it was, your journey.
So over a period of a number of years, I had written not quite weekly, but monthly or so blog posts. So I had some material to start with. I decided when I became a coach that I wanted to write a book to share my experience. I also felt like this was in 2014, and I felt like coming out of a senior executive gig for 3 years, with a 35 million a year company as a VP of marketing and sales, that the landscape was changing and like how people got their information, how they were buying was changing. So I interviewed over 45 entrepreneurs, angel investors, senior marketing and sales execs. So I had these blog posts, I have these interviews with these people. And then I hired a good friend of mine for a half a day and we brainstormed the outline of my book. And it was all there, but I couldn't get it out on my own. Isabel just helped me. So we basically got all the chapter heads, which were really what I call like the 10 strategies or the 10 parts of a business. And then we got all of the major subheads. And then we got a few of the subheads. And we just brainstormed, wrote them all down. And then I afterwards typed them up into an outline. And then I basically started taking content. Like I just find blog posts and I would post them into like where I had this framework. And I would take some of the interviews and I would do that. And that really, sometimes I take a blog post that was 500 words. And when all was said and done, maybe 8 words survived. But the fact I didn't have to write 500 words to start, I could copy paste them. And it seemed roughly something to do with the subheading that I was working on. That really helped. And I also gave myself a deadline. So I gave myself a weekly goal of how much to write, which is when I have coached people around writing books, I really say, you need to make a commitment to a word count a day or a word count a week. And then you need to sit down and put in the time to make that happen. And if you can make that word count happen in an hour, great. But some weeks it might take you 10 to get 300 words out. I mean, that's just sometimes the way it goes. And as the book developed, I picked 10 of the people I'd interviewed and re-interviewed some of them to produce case studies. So every chapter of my book ends with a case study of an entrepreneur friend of mine who I thought was very good at that particular part of business, like marketing, like product management. So a third of the book ended up being other people's work, but I mean, it was still directed from my questions and my final editing. And I wrote them up and I gave them back to the entrepreneur. So asking very specific permission to use these words in my book, because I'm using your words. And even then it probably took 8 or 9 months to produce about 50,000 words, which I think is what the end, and then more by the time I produced a detailed index and, more in doing all the things to get it published. But that was the creative process started with ideas I had from these blog posts. And those were developed by my experience of Robel, the company that I was with for 20 years. But then as I did other executive positions and I noticed things, it was like or things showed up for me, I would turn them into blog posts. So that's my process. I don't know what other people's process is, but that's the one that worked for me.
It's interesting to reflect on as you described that process and what we just talked about earlier about setting goals, right? And
Yes.
one of the elements that I found fascinating is that you talk with somebody else. Either as a team, like you talk to people that you source information. You had another person expertise is in building a book or content. And masterminds talking about leadership. And you mentioned it earlier. This is the time to have a vigorous debate. And I like the use of the word vigorous. That means the passions are roiling, etc. And the end result is that you're not looking for yay sayers. You're looking for best outcome, right? So
Correct.
a devil's advocate per se, moment coming in and have that kind of give you a distilled version of life. My question now is if you're a solopreneur or you're maybe a one or two man group, and I use one or two person group versus, you know what, I've got shareholders or people that have stake in there. How do you manage to get that to come together? So a one or two person or a solo person, you can be mad at yourself, but should have a dialogue with somebody else. But how do you get a larger group of people to get that consensus to roll through and then kind of come out distilled and everybody's still smiling at the end of the day?
So I think there's several ways, in most cities, and I think probably there's virtually, I haven't gone looking for it, is a peer group of other entrepreneurs which are not too far advanced from you and not too far behind where you are, and getting involved with those. And typically it's some sort of networking, like having breakfast once a month. And it takes about a year to establish those relationships and build enough trust to where you can really start. Like you'll get value out of it along the way, but my experience is after about a year, it goes a lot deeper, especially if the core group meets very consistently. So peer group networking on a consistent basis is one way. Having a mentor. So someone who can advise you, who's been there, done that, can look over your plans, give you some feedback. The problem with mentorship is it tends to be ad hoc, and because you're not paying for it, oftentimes you don't pay as much attention. Whereas like being a coach, one of the things I find is for some people, my fees are not in their big scheme of things, like, that they're not a big deal. But because they pay me, they pay a lot of attention. Like it's just this, you paid someone and you want to get value from it. So they pay much closer attention. And part of my, role as a one-on-one coach with entrepreneurs is, do you have a plan? Do you intend to make one? And if you don't want to, it's your business. It's your life. Like I go with whatever you want to do. I may point out some of the downsides of not having a plan and some of the upsides of having one. And I'm not too pedantic. I have I have this template I use for strategic facilitation. And I do ask my clients if they're going to hire me, like that's the template they need to use. But on my one-on-one clients, I have 2 or 3 different templates of varying levels of complexity. And I kind of offer them up. If they're just getting started, I offer, there's a guy out of Atlanta, David Cummings, whose writing I really like. He's more in the software as a service, but he's really just a fantastic entrepreneur. And he's taken Vern Harnish's one-page strategic plan and made it even simpler. So I have the David Cummings one-page strategic plan. And if you Google that, you can actually get to his blog post. You don't need me if you want to just find the template. Now, if you need some help to actually fill in the parts of the plan, you might want me, but that's up to you. And, hiring expertise when you need it. If you're not super expert at market or market research, then find the people who are to do some of those things for you so that you have much better data to work from. And you'd be surprised. One of the things that I know is true in Canada, I don't know for your listeners outside of Canada, but public libraries in Calgary, in Vancouver, and probably a couple of other public libraries, they have research divisions. So in Vancouver, it's called Info Action. In Calgary, it's called Research Plus. You hire these people on an hourly basis. And I've hired them to do all sorts of interesting things. I hired Research Plus in Calgary to find my birth father, which was not a business related, but was a very interesting experience. In fact, they wrote about it on their website and created a blog post about that. I've hired InfoAction in Vancouver to do market research for me, to do competitive analysis for me. They're not that expensive. I don't know what their current rates are. It's probably under $200 an hour. And I usually give them a task like I'm trying to get an answer to this question, or I'm trying to understand this thing better. And would you put 4 hours into it and then tell me how far you got? And then we'll decide whether to do more. So, say roughly with GST and everything, $1,000. Even as a solopreneur, that's a pretty good investment if you're trying to figure some stuff out about your business, about your competitors, even if you're a retailer in a local market and helping to get better insight on who your online competitors are. And again, these people, this is what they're trained to do. So they're really, really good at it. Like they're 10 times better at it than I could ever be. And they have access to databases and resources that's like the Vancouver Public Library subscribes to that I don't have access to, that I would have to pay additional fees to gain access to. InfoAction sometimes charges for access to those databases, but they get it at the library rate. So it's usually like a really small incremental cost. So those are some of the ways that I have used to not do it alone and to get outside help in building my business plan and building my business, even as a single individual. I mean, as a coach, I'm a solopreneur.
Goal setting is often talked about more than done well. What do you find the biggest ditches, the biggest roadblocks to good goal setting is? What are the mistakes?
I think there's two really, really big ones. The first is setting too many goals. So I think that if you have 4 or 5 goals in a quarter and you achieve them all, you're doing super well. And I think I remember I created a strategic plan at Robel one year with 12 goals. And well, I mean, my employees were completely confused. Like, what do they go focus on? Like, how do they choose between goal number 2 and goal number 11? So short set of goals. Actually, I'm going to say there's more than 2 things. Short set of goals. One of those goals has to be the number one thing. Like the most difficult thing we have as entrepreneurs is making the number one thing be the number one thing. So on your goal setting, you got to make sure you know what the number one thing is. A separate problem is making sure you focus on the number one thing, but that's a different issue. We're talking about the goal setting process right now. Then the other thing that is really common and which I do a lot of work in facilitation around is unclear finish lines. So you have to have a goal where you go say, in the next 13 weeks, we're going to achieve this goal, goal A. So I say to people, okay, we get together in 13 weeks and we've forgotten 90% of the conversation that we've had today. Like when I put this in front of you, how will you know that you got there? How will we know the goal A is complete? And that often breaks down right away. Like, well, maybe this, or what'll happen is I'll have 5 people in the room and 3 of them will be telling me how they know that they achieved A, none of which is complimentary. Like they're all orthogonal to each other. One of the kind of examples is a goal. Some group will agree that improving customer support is the goal. Well, it's not a goal. It's an intention. It's maybe a wish. Because I'll say, well, how do you measure customer satisfaction right now? Oh, we don't. Well, okay. So you have no data to know whether it's bad or good even, and you certainly don't have any data to know if it's improving. So maybe a reasonable goal for the quarter is to put a system in place where all new customers are surveyed within 3 days, or given an opportunity to answer a survey within 3 days of them closing the deal. You get to the end of the quarter and that's a clear finish line. Either every new customer is getting a survey within 3 days or they're not. Then the next quarter, the goal might be to collect data for a quarter and see how the survey is, what is anyone actually taking it? Is anyone giving you responses? Then build a process to collect and collate the responses And then at the end of that quarter, as part of the planning session, I'd usually have them actually bring the collated data, and we would spend an hour like discussing it and looking at it and figuring out its importance, and then decide to either pursue with the current methodology that got invented, in which case then the goal would be, okay, we need to take these responses from this level to this, level 1 to level 2. So that would be like the third quarter goal. So that's like 3/4 of goals, each one of which is measurable. But the opening wish, we have to improve customer service, not a goal. So short set of goals, number one thing is the number one thing, and goals that have very clear finish lines that you got to cross them in the time frame that you set.
Your book, Win in the Sales.
Mhm.
You have concrete actions in there.
I do.
So what's one transformative action that an entrepreneur can take that rocket them forward?
If you don't know where you're going, how do you know if you're successful or not? Right? So that's why I suggested know where you're going, as I think I suggested as the title for this podcast. I do think that is one of the most valuable. It's interesting how resistant people are to planning. And some people just won't do it, and that's fine. Like, it's not for me to say, your method is your method. And I also coach entrepreneurs to try and plan beyond their business and to look at, I usually ask them to look at their self. Like, what are the goals you have for yourself? Like, what is it that you do that really renews you and refreshes you and builds your resiliency? And what have you got for the next quarter that you're going to do? Is it like go to the racetrack and race cars? My former coach, Kevin Lawrence, that's one of his passions. And I've got one of my clients just bought a high performance car, and he was going to take it a couple of weekends to go out to a race car, and it's hang out with hang out with people that really like that. And that's just for him. Right. And then so your business is one category, yourself is another category, and then your life and relationships. And I think the process of actually writing down goals for each of those areas is very, very powerful, because it causes you to, and here's what we know from a coaching perspective. If you sit down and you write down your goals, you're 50% more likely to achieve them, even if you never, ever look at your goal list again. Now, if you pull it out on a regular basis and actually evaluate your progress against your goals, you get about another 25% boost in the probability you're going to achieve them. So the actual process of setting goals is very, very powerful. Actually, pen to paper or keyboard into spreadsheet, however you like to do it, is in of itself a very powerful exercise. And I think, to answer, I forget which of you asked me that question, but to make, Bernie, you were asking me for my book, that's planning piece, I think it's a huge lever piece. It really can lever a lot of other things to happen. And then even more so if you are a bigger business and you're the CEO and you have a leadership team, right? Because my thesis, well, it's not mine, I've got this from several other people, but is it strategy, aka your plan, or is it execution? How well you do your plan? Like, which one is more important? And my response is neither, because it's all about alignment. Are you and your senior leadership team aligned in where you're going and what has to happen? Are all the people who report to your senior leadership team, are they clear on where the company is going and what has to happen? And it's the alignment that is the most important piece, right? And when I've worked for companies where the C-suite is not really clear on the goals, and to like the people that are reporting to them, in which case then we're unclear to what the goals are to the people who work for us. And so there's just a lot of hand waving. And I'm a keen sailor, so I use a boat analogy, which is we're all in a boat and we're pulling on the oars, and we're pulling on the oars really, really, really hard, but we're not aligned. We're splashing a lot of water and we're making a lot of noise, but the rowboat's just going around in circles because we don't have clear direction, and we're not making sure that we're aligned and pulling in the same direction that we've agreed we want to go in. I've certainly lived through some of those experiences, and having a clear vision of where you want to go, back to this, where do you want to be in 2 or 3 years? what do you need to achieve this year so you can get to where you want to be in 3 or 5 years? And then what do you need to do this quarter to get to the goals that you have for the year? Those are very, very powerful. A process that keeps looking at them, evaluating how well you're doing and refreshes is what really makes it work. It's not a static process. It's not plan once, throw away and forget.
It was great on a coffee cup.
Yeah. I'll have to think about that.
I was raised with visionaries and entrepreneurs. And then I also met grinders.
Mhm.
Sometimes they're the same people, sometimes they're not. How do you find visionary through the daily grind and not get overwhelmed?
That's interesting. So, I've had it suggested to me, and I've never done research to see if it's true. Like, there's two kind of entrepreneurs. There's visionary entrepreneurs and there's operational entrepreneurs. I would say in Robel, the company I was with for 20 years, Bob was much more the visionary and I was more the operational, practical guy. But we both had quite strong elements of that in ourselves. And I'm one of the strange entrepreneurs that is very visionary and very operational. The way I, you know, recommend people find their way through that is to find a partner, or if not a partner, then find senior leaders or your support network if you're going to be a solopreneur who backfill the part of you that doesn't like. So if you're not the operational piece, you're the visionary, like someone still needs to get stuff done, but it probably shouldn't be you because that's not your strength. Right. So how do you hire a GM? Or how can you afford to hire a GM? Sometimes that's the question. Like, how can you get to the business to be big enough you can afford to hire the GM? Or can you find a way to hire an office manager 1 day a week? Because there are a lot of office managers that actually like working for multiple companies because they get bored. If they were full-time with one company, they'd kind of get bored. They like the challenge of working with different companies. Those people do exist and you can find them. And I think in general, that's a study done in the early 2000s by a friend of mine for the National Research Council of Canada looked at 45 startups in Canada and studied that were successful. And in every single case, one of two things happened. The founder CEO either grew brand new skills and like filled in what they didn't have, or they hired, like, so if they weren't good at marketing, they hired a really, really super marketing person that was much smarter and much better than them at that. Or the founders went back to becoming like the chief technology officer, because most of these were all technical tech startup kind of companies. And they brought in like a CEO who could do all the other pieces. I want to just segue slightly. I have a coaching belief, a belief about people that is, we should always play to our strengths. Like we can take our weaknesses and, if I have a weakness and in a year I can move it from 2 to 3 on a scale of 10, that's probably a huge amount of work and it doesn't move the needle. Whereas I can take a strength that's at 96.5% and I can help you move it to 97%. That probably has massive impact. So I really work with, one of the very first things I do when people become one-on-one clients with me is I give them this book, Strength Finders 2.0, and it has a little survey in it. And the book suggests I think it's around 42 different strengths. And what it does is you take the survey and it identifies your top 5. And then what I do is I help people focus on their top 3. And again, if you just go with me for just another minute or so here. The other thing when clients are new to me and I go through this with them is our strengths get us a long ways, but we often operate in our strengths unconsciously, and sometimes they don't serve us. I'd say a third of my clients, their number one strength is competitiveness. That can be very, very powerful, can help you build a great business, can help you really compete. But I ask them, how's that working with your spouse? And they didn't even realize, like most of the time, they're actually competing with their spouse because it's so deeply hardwired into them. They don't even realize they're operating that way. And I say, and how's it going competing with your kids? And we do this sometimes as parents, and we're like trying to outcompete math problems with our kids. And that's probably not healthy for us. And it's definitely not healthy for our children. So yes, operate in your strengths and understand when being in your strengths may actually be detrimental to what it is that you want to have and be in life.
Probably explains why I shouldn't wallpaper with my wife, or why I don't like wallpapering with my spouse.
Why? Because you're both trying to compete to see who's best at it?
Yeah, no, we're both trying to she does project work. And so
Mhm.
sometimes, it's like having two captains on a boat.
Yeah. Not good.
Well, you're stepping over each other. There's no win out of that. Sure,
No.
win.
Yeah, absolutely.
One thing that you need to do when you take on a new client is agree with what the metrics are, that if they get there, you did a good job. So, what are the numbers you pick, hopefully with their input, to say these are what we will be striving on?
So I do nothing except I give the clients an intake form and I ask them to set goals for 6 months, 12 months, and 18 months. And I encourage them to do it along the lines I suggested earlier, which comes from my former coach, Kevin Lawrence, and his book, Your Auction Mess First, which is in 6 months, what's one goal for your business? What's one goal for just yourself? Something that you're going to do that's just for you. And what's one goal that's for your life, relationships, family, whatever's important to you. And same, one each in 12 months and 18 months. Some new clients get stuck on that. And I sometimes coach, like I say, let's have another coaching call. I won't charge you for it, to just help you get clearer on what those might look like and what they might be. And then I ask questions like, what do you want in a coach? What do you not want in a coach? 6 months from now, if you're looking back, how will you know that investing in me was a good investment for you?
That was my question.
Yeah. So again, those are all on my intake form, so that, I mean, I'll help anyone who's struggling with any of those questions if they need it. But I find those last set, the goals sometimes need to help with, often don't. But the last set, I never do. People know what they want in a coach, what they don't want. And they're usually pretty clear. If they've got to the point they've reached out to me and we've had an initial coaching call, then they have a pretty good idea of what they're hoping to get out of the coaching relationship. So again, I let them define it.
David, just kind of hone us in on the home run here. At the end of the day, what points do you want our listeners to focus on? They're in a startup phase, or they've kind of moved forward, and, they're churning and they're a bit lost. What are the key things you want to highlight for them?
So the first thing I want to highlight is, do you need to do it alone? Like, is there someone else you can get help with and in your corner? Because all of us get our nose pressed up into the tree bark and we cannot notice that we're actually in a forest. And sometimes we just cannot solve the problem until someone helps us pull back and see the forest, or at least pulls us back enough that we can see what the hell bark we're pushing our nose into. Like, sometimes it's just, could we get 12 inches of perspective? Like, sometimes that's all it needs. So is getting some outside help, however that looks like, whether it's peer-based, whether it's a mentor, whether it's a coach, like whatever works for you. The other thing is, we all get caught up working in our business. The next phone call, the next email, the next crisis, the next fire, the next this, the next that. And the true value creation comes from working on your business, pulling back, like sometimes new clients who've been in business for a while, the business has been really successful and they've got totally sucked into the operation. And I start with them and I say, hey, like 8 years ago, why did you start this business? And they're like, and then they don't stop talking for 20 minutes. And but the things they're doing day to day don't relate back to why they started the business. And they need to rediscover that passion, and often need to reorganize the business, hire someone, delegate, so that they can get back to that why. And so getting out of the being in the business to step back and look at why do I have this business? What do I want out of it? Where do I want it to go? And it doesn't have to be arduous. You can do this in a couple hours, maybe a half a day. You can do it on your own. I think it's better if you can involve someone else. There are lots of templates. They don't have to be complicated. In fact, I encourage you to find simple ones. Simple is good. And I think you'll just dramatically increase both the performance, but more importantly, your enjoyment of your business if you take the time out to do this.
David, this certainly resonated with me, but if it resonated with our audience, how do we get a hold of you?
Thanks, Wayne. So first of all, I want your listeners to know that I offer free 1-hour coaching to anyone that wants it. So if you're stuck on something in business or in life, reach out to me and we'll schedule a call and I'll do my best to give you some progress on that. In fact, my commitment to you is if you spend 1 hour with me, you'll have 3 ideas to accelerate your business in the next 90 days. Now, to reach out to me, if you just go to my website, djgreer.com, that's coach, D as in David, J as in James, Greer.com. On the top left corner of every page of my website is my phone number and my email address. There's a contact form too. So whatever's easiest for you, use that to reach out to me and take me up on my offer.
Thank you, David Greer, to my co-host, Wayne Pratt, and you, the Knack for Business listeners. If you're starting your journey in business, launching, reach out to David. He's your man, and he'll offer great advice. And if you have an addiction issue, you can also work in that space too. That refers back to our first podcast that we did. To reach us at info@creativeinsight.com. It's info at KREATIVINSIGHT.com, or website is creativeinsight.com. Wayne, how can folks reach you, sir?
Best way is my website, motivateyou.ca, MOTIVE, the numeral 8, .ca. And my email is wayne@motivateyou.ca.
If you would like to be a guest on this podcast and share your knowledge, let us know. We would also appreciate your feedback on the content or format. Check the show notes for more details. For these podcasts, we like to acknowledge the support and thanks to the following people. Carl Richards from Podcast Solutions Made Simple, a renowned podcast expert. Fred Crouch, who is the Property Wizard podcaster, where Bernie is a co-host. Jovan Streaker from At Hive, a co-working space that is more than just a space. Then Melanie Weber, Bernie's invaluable business partner. And Wayne Pratt from Motivate You Inc., who serves as both a coach and co-host of these podcasts. Disclaimer. Please note that the Knack for Business podcast episodes are meant solely for educational and general informational purposes. The information and opinions contained within are not intended to be professional advice on any subject matter. The thoughts, views, and opinions expressed by the participants are their own personal beliefs and do not represent the views of the podcast hosts or any affiliated organizations. It is important to note that this podcast is not a replacement for consulting with certified experts in your area who possess knowledge of your unique situation. The hosts of the podcast, along with any participants or affiliated groups, do not take responsibility for any actions taken or not taken based on the information presented in this episode. It is highly recommended that individuals seek guidance from their own personal advisors in fields such as accounting, law, or other pertinent areas prior to undertaking any actions or making decisions that may impact their financial, legal, or other aspects of life.